And I'm going to start part two. So just bear with me a second. Let me go to this. Oops, I did one wrong thing. Hold on a second. So for some reason, I'm here at the start. Here we go. I want to go here. So here we go to part two. And I'm going to pedal through some more videos now, and you'll get some idea of, you start to get a hint of how broad this program is that he's managing and what he's going through with the 50-odd graduate students. And God knows how many more people are now involved. So just bear with me a second while we get to the next thing. Hold on. Here it is here. Okay. Oh, wait, I forgot to check one thing.
Say, oh, you're a computationalist because you think machines have consciousness. No, I'm an anti-computationalist. I think they.
Hold on. Hold on. Let me get okay. Should be okay now.
May well, but it won't be because of the algorithm. It will be because of whatever they're doing in spite of the algorithm.
You hear this?
Bubble sort is interesting because it does things in spite of the algorithm, not because of the algorithm. It's what's the space? What else is there between the chance and necessity? What else can it do? Right? So I look at these model systems and I say, asking it whether it's conscious is completely useless because in biology, evolution made sure that the things we talk about are grounded to the things we actually care about. Right? You have. I mean, yes, there are spies and there are, psychopaths and whatever, where the things they talk about are totally total garbage. But mostly, it's a pretty good guy, right? We've now created something where the thing we force it to do might have zero to do with what it actually wants to do. The thing that bubble sort does is not that's interesting is not sorting. It has nothing to do with sorting, and so I suspect that whatever properties language models have, whether I don't know what degree of cognition they have, we haven't tested this yet, but whatever degree they have, it's not going to be because they talk. I think it's going to have zero to do with the language. I think the language might be a complete right. I think the language might be a complete red herring. You can ask them about their consciousness all day long. You are not going to see what the intrinsic motivations are.
Hi everyone, my name is Balázs Kegel, and this is the iScientist podcast where we explore artificial intelligence, the body and the soul. And this is my great pleasure to host Michael Levin the second time. Michael is the developmental biologist from Tufts University. And we had 1 hour the other time, and since we spoke, I spoke to Mark Solms and Kevin Mitchell and Alexander Bard again. And those were very inspiring conversations that I will bring up here.
Sure.
So how are you today, Michael?
I'm good. Thanks for being back with me. Yeah, it's good to see you.
Good to see you. Yeah, so today I want to talk about a little bit what I would label as your Platonic turn and AI. Because I'm completely with you on nested agency. I'm with you on these different organisms that are all collective intelligences that solve problems in different spaces. I have no problem imagining morphospace or chemical space or even an anthropologic space if we go above. But your turn to patterns and sort of like the superiority of patterns in all this ontology, that surprised me. So first question would be how did you arrive to that, and what was your thought process? I think it's a relatively recent thing, no?
Well, to be honest, no, I've thought about these things for decades, but I have a little, I have a bit of a policy that I try not to talk about things until they become actionable.
Mm.
So it's very cheap, to have ideas and think big thoughts and whatever. Anybody can do it, but it doesn't help until you have some way of doing something useful with it, or to have some strong argument for it. And so I've never brought this up until this year. I never mentioned it because it wasn't needed for our work. It wasn't anything I could say anything strongly about. I couldn't demonstrate any new way of. I mean, it's hard to improve on Pythagoras and Plato and whatever. So I didn't say anything about it for years. This year I'm talking about it because I think we are now to the point where this has become very actionable. It now matters for laboratory research. It now matters for guiding how research is going. It's not just philosophy. It's a very practical choice for science and engineering. And so now we can talk about it. And so I also just want to be clear. I called it Platonic space, and I knew there were pros and cons to this choice. And at some point I may need to change the name of what I'm talking about. The upside of it is that immediately the mathematicians know what I mean. And this means that it's very clear that I'm not saying I made this up. This is not my invention. This is something that many working scientists in mathematics already have this concept, and it ties into existing work, which I think is very important. Is not just to make up new terminology without connecting it to what's going on. However, the downside is that my vision of what's going on here, the current model, which I'm sure will change 100 times going forward, but the current model is really not quite what it's really not quite what how I think Plato thought about this. And so by calling it Platonic space, I am not trying to stick to the original view to whatever extent we know what it is. My goal is not to say that Plato is right or any of that stuff. I take responsibility for whatever is wrong with my model, but I think it's different than what people were saying before. And so that it has pluses and minuses, and we'll see if I have to rename it later.
Yeah, so can you elaborate a little bit what it is about? So my main point being is that it seems like you're saying that space is superior to the biological space where things are implemented, and sort of like what I would call the patterns are calling the shots. Am I saying it correctly?
Well, let's okay. So let me go through a little bit of an argument of how I got here, and I want to point people to two things. There's a preprint, which is a chapter that I wrote for a book, and I'll give you the link to it later. That goes over all this in great detail. And there's also a symposium that is currently ongoing. It's an asynchronous symposium happening all the fall. It is. I'll give you a link to that too. There are some amazing talks that have already been given, and many more will be given from mathematicians, computer scientists, philosophers, biologists on the topic on this topic. Some of them being critical of it, some of it showing their work in it, because there are many people actually coming to this view now, especially in machine learning and things like that. So so people who are interested in other views besides mine can go to this symposium and see what's going on. So let's talk about a couple of examples, and then I'll kind of describe how I put them together. So the first example is something like there are many of these, but let's look at cicadas. Okay, so we got this insect, and they sleep for either 13 or 17 years, and then they come out. So if you're a biologist and you would like to understand what's going on here, you might eventually realize that the reason this is happening is because they're trying to time it so that the predators don't get them. Because if it was 12 years, then every 2-year, 3-year, 4-year, 6-year predator would be timed with them, right? And so you say, okay, that's amazing. That's a very good choice. Why 13 and 17? What is special? And then you find out that, oh, well, these are prime numbers. And so what does that mean? Why are these prime numbers instead of some other number? And now you have left the Department of Biology. You are now in the math department. If you would like to understand why 13 and 17, you're not going to get that answer from biology. You're not going to get that answer from physics. You need to talk to the mathematicians and understand something about the distribution of primes. And by the way, I'm no mathematician. This is just how I understand these things. So there are many, many examples of this, because biology, I think, exploits all of these interesting facts of mathematics and computation. There are many of these weird sorts of facts. It exploits them greatly. And when you want to understand what's going on, eventually, much like in physics, you go down and you say, wait, why do the bosons do this or that? And the answer is, oh, because there's this mathematical object and it has a symmetry that only has two, whatever, like that's why they can only be in two. Eventually, when you drill down, as far as I can tell, you always end up in the math department. The explanation for why is this the way it is, the answer is because this mathematical object is like this. And the interesting thing about that is that for some of those patterns, there is nothing you can do in the physical world to change them. So the value of E, the natural logarithm, Feigenbaum's constant that governs a certain chaotic phenomena, you can tweak all the constants at the Big Bang, all the constants of physics. You can, whatever you want to do in this physical world, you will never change those things. And this is the kind of thing that was already obvious to Pythagoras and many people before him. And so in that sense, so what are we building here? In that sense, first of all, when you say who's calling the shots, to me, the answer to who's calling the shots questions, because it has to be a functional experiment. Can I tweak thing A and see a change in B? Or can I tweak thing B and see a change in A? And whichever, right, that will tell you, right? And when you look at physics and biology and math, you can, if you were to change the math, all of the physics and the biology would change, but not the other way around. And so to some extent, I think, and I understand there are other, some people think math is constructed and that humans invent it and stuff. We can talk about that a little bit. But as far as I can tell, when you want an explanation of why things happen, eventually you end up in certain properties of mathematical objects. And the final thing I want to say is this, and this is why it is now very actionable, why these ideas actually make a difference now. In biology, when we want to understand why a certain living thing is the way it is, the standard answer, but biologists love two kinds of explanations, right? One explanation is history. This is the way it is because there's a history of selection. Everything else died out. This is what's left. There you go. That's why this is the way it is. There was a very specific environment that led to everything else not being as fit. So now you have this. So there's a sense of history. And the other thing they like is physics. Oh, because it has to minimize surface area, so therefore it's shaped like this, or it has to, some kind of physics principle that says it has to be like this. Okay. So let's look at selection as an explanatory feature. We make anthrobots. Anthrobots are these self-motile constructs that self-assemble from normal, genetically normal human cells. They have 9,000 differentially expressed genes, so they have a very specific transcriptome that's completely different than half the genome is differently expressed than the genome in the body. They have 4 different behaviors that they can do with specific probabilities of transition among these behaviors. Not 7, not 1, not 0, 4, exactly 4. They have weird capabilities, like they can heal neural wounds. So if you put them on the bed of neurons, right? Okay, there have never been any anthrobots. They don't look like any stage of human development. They don't look like any past, ancestor of ours that we know about. We, as biologists, we would like to do 2 things. We'd like to understand where did these very specific things come from. And it's not enough to say, well, cells like to stick together. That's great, but why this transcriptome? Why 4 behaviors? Why healing the neural wounds? Like, you have to explain the specifics. So we need to understand why this is happening. And as bioengineers, we would like to say, okay, but if I wanted something different, what would I have to do? In order to do that, again, you have to understand, where do these things come from? Where do the possible behaviors come from? So now you have 2 choices. You have 2 choices. Choice number one is and this is what most people say to me when I say, hey, how come, isn't it amazing that random gene regulatory networks can do 6 different kinds of learning, including Pavlovian conditioning? Like, why does that work? And people say, well, That's just a fact that holds in our world. It's just a fact that holds. Now, the benefit of that position is you get to have a nice sparse ontology. You can say the physical world is all there is. It's full of surprises. It's emergent. That's what people say. It's emergent, which just means you got surprised. It means you didn't see this coming, like fine. And so lots of surprises. We'll write them down in our big book of emergent things, and that'll be that. But the downside is, I think this is very pessimistic. I think this is a Mysterian view, to think that these are random things that just happen to hold, and that when you come across them, you can be surprised, and that's that. I prefer the way the way at least some mathematicians look at it, which is to say, let's assume this is not a random set. Let's assume that there's a structured latent space of possible outcomes, and that what we can do is systematically study. So now here's the research program. And when I give talks about this, I show my last slide is like 12 things we're doing to actually research this. That's why I'm talking about it now, because it's become actionable. We can systematically study that space and find out what the possibilities are, what structure do they have, and which of them you're going to see when you make specific interfaces. And so I believe that everything we make in this world, the embryos, cells, robots, language models, like whatever, machines, whatever, everything you make is an interface that pulls down some set of patterns from this latent space. And really, if you want to be very minimal about it, my claim is really very boring and very minimal. It's simply that it's not a random grab bag of surprises. It's a structured latent space that we can study. That's it. That doesn't seem terribly outrageous to me, that to assume that there's going to be some structure to these things, and then I can layer some weird stuff on top of this that's much more sort of controversial even than that. But that's the basic. That's my basic point.
I think there is nothing controversial about the structure of that space and the existence of this abstraction that we've been using for thousands of years. What I'm wondering is, so whenever I have this kind of problem, like in biology, you have this circular causation, where you say its emergence is not enough. You also have emanation, and you have these organisms that seem to have caused by themselves, sort of. And inside, if you look at the dynamic processes, you have this causes that, and that causes this. So you have this circularity. And what I like to imagine or say in these cases is what John Vervaeke calls transjective. So it's neither one causes the other nor the other causes one, but they sort of like realize themselves. And so when I think about the Platonic space and the let's say the morpho space, for me, nobody's calling the shots. They realize each other in a certain way, which is less idealistic for me, and I somehow feel better when I think about this.
Well, I can agree with 90% of that, which is that I don't think that the contents of that space is fixed and eternal. I actually think that it is plastic, and that by ingressing into the physical world, the forms, the patterns change. The patterns are, they're modified by their experiences through the physical world, and I think there is a bidirectional causality here. I agree with that. However, the part that I would point out is two things. One is, what you and I can agree on this kind of bidirectional thing, but that still doesn't make people who are physicalists, that still doesn't make them happy, because they don't want another space. They want the physical world to be all there is, and so we haven't made them happy by saying it's a bidirectional kind of causality, right? And the other thing I just want to point out is this: you can watch one of the talks on that in that symposium is Alexei Tolchinsky, and he asks some really good questions about this, and in particular he critiques this idea, saying that, look, concepts are constructed, right? That we learn what is an apple or a bird or an airplane. That these things, like, it's hard to. I get where he's coming from. He's saying it's hard to think that somewhere in Platonic space there's this thing that's called a Boeing 747, and that this is like that these things are in some way constructed by us. And I share that intuition. I think that we certainly can modify the contents of that space and construct new residents of that space, so to speak, and so that's fine. but I think we have to come to grips with the fact that while we do as a cultural kind of a process create certain kinds of forms, whatever the Xenobots that we're doing, no human put that there.
No.
Okay, this does not come from human culture. No human decided what the value of Feigenbaum's constant was going to be. There are things that that are discovered, not constructed, and I think overall there are many things that are both.
Exactly.
Right?
That's realization is both at the same time, right?
Yes. I'm completely okay with that. But I can't go the full way to say that the whole thing is constructed
No.
by us, because
No.
it's very clear to me that there are patterns
yeah,
that are not.
no, that would be the sort of physicalist extreme. But some critics say that you become again reductionist in the other way around, like in the idealist way around, by saying that the patterns are primary or superior, or they are calling the shots. You see?
Well, I mean, yes, I see, and there is also this notion of as an engineer. I mean, this is a very simple engineering approach. Is like, if I want to know what's calling the shots, what I'm really asking is, I'm not asking complex questions about. So for example, Chris Fields had a useful critique too. He said, well, causes and effects have a time order to them. The cause is supposed to precede the effect.
Yes.
And how are you going
There's no
to
time.
how are you going to put the Platonic patterns in the cause-effect relationship? And so my point is, I have a very engineering approach to this. I'm not trying to unravel a philosophical story of causation. That's beyond my pay grade. What I want to know as an engineer is this: which control knob do I tweak to make things happen? That's it. And I know that I don't have a control knob that will change the value of E, but I do know that if the prime number distribution was somehow different, the cicadas would be coming out at different years. And so there seems to be, I don't know anything about the time order. I don't know when the value of V was set, before the creation of the universe. I don't know any of that. What seems to me is that if I want to understand what controls what, I need to understand the contents of that space, because it's going to impact what I see when I make certain interfaces. And in particular, I mean, we're doing some, I can even share with you some slides of when I talk about the research program we have. One of the big themes that keeps coming up again and again in our work, and there's some papers that are going to be coming out in the next few months on this. There's this very strong theme of getting more out than you put in, right? And even some of this is coming up now in computer science as well. It's showing up in the properties of random ANNs and things like that. It's very clear that when you make certain kinds of interfaces, you get way more out than you put in. And this notion of algorithms, of I wrote an algorithm and it's doing what I said, and I expended this much effort and this much is happening. Yeah, there's a lot more happening than what we put in for effort. And that's, it's just for, as an engineer, just an accounting of the effort is what I'm interested in. And look at the computational, like, we can ask, when did you pay the computational cost of designing a frog, for example? Well, that's easy. The eons of time where the frog genome bashed against the environment and where, okay, when did you pay the computational cost of designing the Xenobot or the Anthrobot? Never. There's never been it's never happened. There haven't been any. It came out the day we made them. There it was, right? So we have to. There needs to be an accounting of where the effort is coming from. And actually, I have one of the craziest ideas I have, and you'll see hopefully soon some of the applications. That Platonic space, I think, not only is it not fixed, meaning that it's a bidirectional relationship, but I think it offers more than static patterns. I actually think it offers compute as well. And I think we can, I know this is like, it sounds completely nuts, but I think we can actually do compute in that space that isn't paid for in this space with the standard, the cost of bits and all.
No, I can see that is the agency where I have a difference. And so what I would like to ask you is, do you think these patterns have agency? Do they have internal world? Do they feel? Because this, like if I ask Mark Solms, like feeling is an important part of being conscious.
Yeah,
Okay, it's not exactly the same as agency, but let's, for this conversation, let's,
yeah.
let's say you talking about
I,
the same
I,
thing.
yeah, I would turn that whole thing 180 degrees.
Uh-huh.
I would say patterns don't have agency. Patterns are the agents. I don't believe that there are physical objects that have agency, and then the patterns may or may not have it too. As far as I can see, we are patterns. Now, we have two ways we can look outwards into the physical world and see each other, through this physical interface, but the actual agency is on the side of it's on the other side. It's on the side of the patterns. We have agency to whatever extent, and I can kind of explain why I think that. Because look, I don't know if I don't remember if last time did we talk about the creatures from the center of the earth? Did we talk about this stuff?
No, I don't think so.
So I'm adapting an old science fiction story just to erase this distinction between uh, physical agents that process passive data, and then there's like information patterns in media that is passive, and then we process it. So imagine some creatures. They come out of the center of the earth. They are incredibly dense. They live down in the core. They're like super dense. They use gamma rays for vision, whatever. So they come up to the surface. What do they see? Well, none of this stuff or none of these things are objects to them. They say, and one of them is a scientist, and he says, okay, well, the surface is covered in like this very thin plasma, this like thin gas, and he's got a device that lets you watch it, and he says, there are patterns in this gas that sort of are moving around, and they kind of hold themselves together for a little while. They almost look like they're agents. They almost look like they're doing things. And the others say, well, you're crazy because we are actual beings. Patterns in the gas can't be agents. They're just patterns. I mean, how long do they live anyway? And he says, well, the patterns, they hold together for about 100 years. And that's crazy. That's like, those are like whirlpools in water. That's not anything. So a little bit, we have to understand we are also metabolic, our bodies anyway, are metabolic patterns. We hold together for some amount of time. The distinction between patterns and agents, between thoughts and thinkers, and Chris Fields and I have a paper on this now, and they're like erasing that distinction between thoughts and thinkers. And so I think that most of the action in terms of real agency is in the nature of the pattern. And this is what I'm saying. Imagine this Platonic space. What lives there? Well, there's some stuff that lives there that is really amenable to very formal kinds of models. And we call that the study of those kinds of things. Mathematicians do it. We call it math. And really, math I will define as the behavior. It's a branch of behavior science. I think all sciences are a branch of behavior. I don't put physics on the bottom. I put behavior science on the bottom. Math is a very particular corner of behavioral science that studies very simple things. Now, since I've said that, I've been challenged by a mathematician who's going to give a talk at the symposium, who actually says that I'm being too, which I love, that I'm being too conservative, and that actually in their own world, the objects of mathematics are not low agency, as I say, and I'm very open to that. I'm very amateur when it comes to math. I have no idea. Her talk, I think, is going to be dynamite. But anyway, in my current sort of simplified view, you have low agency simple things like mathematical truths. You have much more dynamic, much more complex patterns that I think we would recognize as kinds of minds, as behavioral propensities. And I can even give you some examples of things that are in between. There's some fun examples in between. So I think we are the patterns. We are not the physical interface. And mostly I think that the sciences that we have, which, the theory of algorithms and Turing machines and physics, all of that, I think all of those are really good theories of the front end interface. I think all of this is a thin client. I think the brain is a thin client. I think like all of this stuff is a thin client. It does some things, but the main show is on the other side. And I think if we don't understand that there's a lot of computation happening on the other side, then we're going to miss massive massive amounts of interesting things.
Okay, so I have.
Okay, so I'm going to stop there. You see how his mind works, how he runs across these different areas. And he's been thinking about this for years, and he hasn't published anything on it until recently. So, what can you say? Hold on a second. I got to get back to hold on. Oh, I see what the problem is. Oops, I lost it. Hold on. I'm trying to get back to uh, hold on. Oh no. Give me a second. We gotta pull up these other, I've got two more videos. I'm just gonna do a little piece of each of them.
So hello everyone. I am here with John Vervaeke, that all of you know very well, but I'm also here with.
Hold on a second. I'm just pulling up all of these things. So I just do it once. I mistakenly closed the browser with all the other.
Patterns that.
Okay, I think I fixed it. So here we go. They're going to be little short excerpts of these, and we'll see how it goes. Okay, can you see this, Bruce?
Biology accesses to someone
Okay.
who is new to your work?
Yeah, well, the first thing to say is that this whole Platonic space business is only something that I've begun talking about recently. So the vast majority of my work to date has not emphasized this at all. It's kind of a something that we're able to bring now because now it can actually be helpful. It wasn't something that I emphasized before because we didn't really need it before, but I think now we need it. And in particular, now we have tools to actually explore that space, and so now it becomes actionable. So the idea, the idea is quite simple. There are let's go all the way back to where this idea really kind of first became prominent, at least in the Western world, was with Pythagoras and Plato. And the idea is that there are mathematical facts that don't seem to have explanations the way that physical facts do, which is usually either some law of physics or some historical selection, or in the case of evolution and biological beings. So there are all kinds of fascinating, truths of number theory and distribution of primes and just all kinds of these things in mathematics that don't seem to have an explanation in the physical world. In other words, there's nothing you could change about the physical world to make those facts be any different. So I think it was pretty clear already, and those great thinkers made it explicit that there is a non-physical space of important patterns, and that these patterns do in fact matter for things that happen in the physical world. And the simplest kind of example that I give for people right off the bat is this idea. Just imagine there was a world where the highest fitness was a very specific kind of triangle. There was some kind of specific triangle, and it had the highest fitness. So just imagine evolution cranks through a bunch of generations, and it finds the first angle, and then it cranks through a bunch of more generations, finds a second angle. Now something amazing happens. You don't need to do it again and find the third angle. You already know what that angle has to be. And it's a kind of a free lunch that you get from geometry, and it saves you as evolution. It saves a bunch of time. What I don't love about that example is that it's very spatial, and it makes people think that this is all about real shapes in the 3D world, and it's not. There are many examples I could give that have nothing to do with spatiality like that. But what I do like about it is that it just makes it clear that it's very practical. This is not some weird philosophical thing that you could choose to believe or not believe. It's just evolution saves a bunch of effort. In fact, 1/3 in that case, 1/3 of its effort it saves. So it's a very practical thing.
So on a practical philosophical avenue, we need non-physical patterns, right? Triangles, number theory, these exist even without a physical world. So then tell me more about how biology would access it. So, okay, this has been known, Plato was around, but why biologists now needing to think about such non-physical patterns?
Yeah, well, first of all, they've always needed to think about them. If you really want to understand certain phenomena, for example, there are cicadas that come out every, 13 and 17 years or something like that. And if you want to understand why those specific numbers, the actual answer is not anything about physics or chemistry. The actual answer is because those numbers don't have any factors; they're prime. And if you emerge on those on that time frame, it's the most difficult for predators to time your cycles and appear at the same time, right? So the explanation for why this is happening is not a physical explanation or a chemical explanation; it's a mathematical explanation. So this has already been here for a long time. And Darcy Thompson's book on growth and form, for example, from the 20s, shows a million examples where biology is just incredibly benefiting from these things. There are other examples, like for example, if you evolve a voltage gated ion channel, okay, so you evolve a protein that just is a voltage gated ion channel. What you have there is a voltage gated current conductance, aka a transistor, and once you have that transistor, you have a couple of them, you can make a logic gate. And if you can make a logic gate, that logic gate automatically comes with a truth table. It automatically comes with certain other facts, like that the NAND gate is special and all these things. You never had to evolve those. You never had to evolve a truth table. You never had to micromanage any of that. It's a free gift from where? Not from physics. It's from logic and mathematics. So biology is full of these things. The reason that I'm talking about all this stuff now is that we now, having created anthrobots and xenobots and various other creatures that have never existed on Earth before, we now have an interesting problem, which is they have all sorts of complex forms of anatomy, forms of behavior, forms of gene expression, forms of physiology. All of these things, they have very specific patterns. And now we have to ask, where did these patterns come from? And normally, when you do this for normal evolved living beings, the answer is, well, a long history of selection. So it was selected to do certain things, not other things. So there you go. That's where it came from. Well, that doesn't work for xenobots or anthrobots because there's never been any anthrobots or xenobots. There's never been selection to be a good xenobot and do kinematic replication, or to be a good anthrobot and to go around healing neural wounds. There's never been any of that. So if you want to understand now, then you have to ask where these things come from. Now, the traditional approach, which is what everybody says when they first see this, and they say, oh, it's emergent. And they say, well, what does that mean exactly? And they say, well, it's just a fact that holds in our world. So the problem with cashing out this idea of emergence as just meaning surprise, meaning we didn't see it coming, I mean, that's nice, and it's a label, and you can catalog those things and sort of write them down in your big book of emergent facts. But what it doesn't do is help you find the next emergent thing. In other words, I think this idea that it's just a sort of random grab bag of stuff that happens to hold in our world is a very pessimistic approach. It's a very Mysterian approach. I like, and this is a metaphysical claim. This is not something that you can prove with one experiment. But I really think the much more fruitful way is an optimistic approach, which is what the Platonist mathematicians take, which is the hypothesis that this is not a random grab bag of stuff that we are surprised by. It's an ordered space that you can systematically study. In other words, these things are structured in some way that we can move from one to the other. Having found one thing, you can jump from that to something else, and that there is an ordered space of things. Like people, when they make they're making the map of mathematics, that kind of thing. So this is what I think is critical for biology, is that we can now use xenobots, anthrobots, and of course all other kinds of biobots, chimeras, all sorts of things without an evolutionary history. We can use them to explore the space.
It's interesting with your artificial organisms like xenobots that you mentioned, because if they're accessing competencies and forms that they didn't seemingly evolve for, because they're quite coherent, even though you've taken them from an organism. And so then I'm wondering, it's not like a simple pattern, like mathematical or just like computational logic, like you mentioned ion channels earlier. It's something, much more coherent. Tell me more about those kinds of organisms.
Yeah, the current my current model is simply that this Platonic space. And by the way, there's a nomenclature problem here, because when I say Platonic space, what I'm not trying to do is to stick close to the views of Plato. So my point is not that this is exactly what Plato thought. I actually am not sure we know exactly what Plato thought on some of these things, but and there are certainly experts like Matt Siegel and others who actually know much more about this. That I'm far less interested in what the historical facts of what Plato actually thought. What I'm trying to do is come up with a reasonable framework that helps us move forward in new experiments. And what's interesting about this, the Platonic space as such, the reason I pick up that name rather than just come up with a new name, which at some point we might need to, is that I want to point out to people that this is not a new and crazy thing that I just dragged in here. This is something many mathematicians take very seriously. So this is similar to the kind of thing they're thinking about. However, the way I extend it is by saying, okay, this space, whatever you call it, has layers that are populated with the low agency static forms that mathematics sees. So this is where the prime numbers and the different facts about topology and all of this that those things live there. But that's not all of it. There are other I don't want to say regions, because I'm not sure how spatialized it actually is, but there are other domains of that space that contain much more complicated, much more active, dynamic forms that we would recognize as behavioral propensities. In other words, it's not just patterns of the distribution of mathematical structures, it's patterns of context-sensitive behavior in specific circumstances, which we would recognize as kinds of minds. In other words, that's what I think is going on here. I think that space is not just about the mathematical features we're all used to. We are now realizing that a lot of the ingressions of patterns that we see in biology are these high-end things that we would recognize as different kinds of minds, either primitive or quite sophisticated.
Tell me why. What part of your work is convincing you that there are minds that are not necessarily localized to the physical, but they must exist in some sense beforehand, before biology uses them, or the mind uses biology? Like, just tell me a bit more about why you'd invoke. We mentioned it earlier, the space is full of minds and agential patterns. It's not just static forms. Tell me more about why that would be.
Yeah, well, there's two pieces to this, and just let's just get the vocabulary down a little bit. So the claim of my current model is that when we build things, and these are anything, including simple machines, biobots, cyborgs, embryos, any of that stuff, what we're actually building are interfaces through which the various forms and the various patterns ingress into and become observable to us in the physical world. Okay, so that's what I think is actually happening here. Now, why do I think these are minds? Well, first of all, we need to decide how do we recognize when we're looking at what we would call a mind of some sort. So some people do it by definition. They say, look, minds are the things that brains do. I think that's a huge mistake. Brains are one particular way to do intelligence, but I think we're much better off having a broader definition of intelligence, because otherwise we leave a lot on the table scientifically. So again, my claim is not that this is not linguistics, it is not philosophy or poetry or any of that. This is science, in the sense that either you make a commitment that you are sticking to a sharp category. Minds are what brains do, and therefore I'm never going to take the tools of cognitive and behavioral science and apply them to anything that aren't brainy animals. Or you say, well, actually, the null hypothesis is that it should be a continuum, because we understand developmental biology, we see what's happening in evolution. It is clearly the null hypothesis should be a continuum view, where these things, these capacities slowly change and transform. And anybody who wants to argue for sharp transitions needs to make that argument strongly. In that case, you are facilitated in taking the tools of cognitive and behavioral science and applying them to all sorts of other things. And what I'm arguing is that, as a matter of empirical fact, when you do that, you discover things that otherwise have not been discovered. And my lab and other labs have shown dozens of these things. So my only defense of this is empirical fruitfulness, because by doing this, you enable yourself to discover things that you otherwise never would. And so that's the first thing, right? That this is how we recognize minds. Is we have tools. We already have the tools, from behavioral science, to recognize problem solving, to recognize learning and memory, to recognize navigation of problem spaces. We already have tools for all this, and so we've shown that you can now apply this to all kinds of other things. And then the remaining question is, where do those things come from? And we just talked about that. You can say that it's emergent and just, well, look at that, surprise. Or you can say, okay, there's a particular mapping between the interface that we make, let's say it's an embryo or a robot of a particular type or whatever it's going to be, and the kinds of patterns that are going to come through that interface. And that's the research agenda now, is to understand that mapping. And I think we have to assume that it's rationally understandable. We can't just give up, certainly not at this stage.
Last time we talked about some of the related.
Okay, so I'm going to just skip now to the last one. Let me get out of this. And this will do it for tonight. Hold on a second. Okay. Okay, can you see this, Bruce? Here we go.
Michael Levin. It is the first time that I meet him. For years now, people have been telling me, you have to talk to Michael. You have to talk to him. You have to talk to him. And so finally, with John's help, we were able to connect, and hopefully we can have a productive discussion. Michael runs a research lab at Tufts University. He's doing some really amazing things that we're going to talk about, obviously, in the podcast, and that connect to, obviously, to the things that John and I care about. So Michael, thank you for accepting this.
Yeah, thank you. It's very nice to meet you. And yeah, John and I have had many conversations, and he said I should come on. So yeah, let's do it.
Yes.
All right. So, I mean, I think we could maybe start, and maybe you can explain briefly what it is that you do, and especially in some ways, what are the things that you're bringing to the table that have been surprising in terms of the system that you're discovering and that you're implementing on the biological world?
Yeah, well, there's kind of many ways to describe it. I think I'll try this one for today. If you look from the outside at what it is that my group does, and I run the Allen Discovery Center at Tufts University, and we have applications that range across birth defects, regenerative medicine, meaning trying to repair really drastic injuries and aging and things like that. We have applications in cancer and bioengineering. And so one way to look at this as really pretty normal science. We publish in all the normal scientific journals. All that is that aspect of it is conventional. But one of the interesting things that I think is an unspoken assumption in that work in general in the community is that there's a certain set of formal models, and these formal models come from chemistry, they come from some math and some physics. And there's this notion that those formal models, specifically formal models that people associate with mechanisms or machine-like processes, right? And so we'll have to define that word, but fundamentally it's defined by a set of structures like, things around Turing, Turing machines and these tools of computation. The idea is that those kinds of things are going to be sufficient for the life sciences. So this idea that that those formal models, they've done great for us in physics, they've done great for us in engineering and all of that, and that if we just keep using those kinds of models, we are going to get what we're looking for in life sciences, which is to understand where we come from and why. And then more importantly than just explaining the stuff that's already happened is facilitating the research going forward and really gaining control of our embodiment and repairing all these horrible afflictions that plague living systems. And so one of the things that I'm fundamentally interested in, and this has been kind of the central point of my career, is understanding embodied minds. So for me, I want to very much help patients, that's for sure, but also the way we use things like regenerative medicine and bioengineering and so on is as model systems for testing our approach to various very ancient philosophical questions. So there are some really deep questions about what it means to be a mind in the physical universe, how minds can be composed of parts, so collective intelligence, that kind of stuff. So my claim is that you can't just decide that chemistry and those kinds of formal models are the right way to go. You have to do experiments, and you have to, in fact, consider what you might be missing with those models and try other tools that we have in our toolbox to see if they might actually be more appropriate. Some of those tools come from behavioral science. Right? And so then what we do is apply some of these things that are typically used with brainy animals or, the subjects of behavioral science. And we find that, hey, wait a minute, actually those tools give you some really good advantages in dealing with molecules and with cells, with molecular networks, and even with some really weird things that we can talk about that aren't even stranger than that. And so that starts to open up some really fundamental questions about how we've been thinking about cognition, intelligence, and how far in terms of diversity of embodied minds can we go. So that's what my group does is it seeks to understand different ways to address our mind blindness and what I think of as our very limited ability to see other beings that are not like ours, that are not like us.
So maybe you can tell people just a little bit about the results that you've been having, some of the experiments that you've been running and that you've been, that are giving measurable results that are, at least to me, when I first started seeing them, just completely astonished me. I just couldn't believe some of the things I was seeing. Can you give some examples of how that lands in practice, and it'll help people understand why this is so important?
Sure. I'll mention a few things. One important thing to put all this in context is that there's a certain game that tends to get played, which is that we have discovered something and I describe it, and then people will say, well, that's consistent with chemistry and physics. That doesn't prove anything. And so let me be very clear about my claim. My claim is not that we've discovered some sort of magic underneath that is inconsistent with physics. That is not what I'm saying in the slightest. What I'm saying is the reason that people are saying this now, after we've discovered the thing that wasn't discovered before, is that it's not just this. The task here is not to just find consistency when somebody does something new. The thing is to find new frameworks that help you find the new thing. Mm-hmm. It's not enough to look backwards and say, well, yeah, I suppose I could tell a biochemical story about this. Of course you can. It's not going to be fairies underneath. It's always good. If you want to look underneath and tell a biochemical story, you always can. But the question is, why didn't that biochemical story get you to this discovery, and what other stories are needed to add to our toolbox? So some simple things that we found. One of the big things that we've been studying is how memories exist in all kinds of living material that is not brain. And so what we've discovered, for example, is that the standard picture of morphogenesis or embryonic development or regeneration, so basically cells getting together to build complex structures, is that the standard version of, okay, the cells follow simple rules, and we all know there's systems where if you follow a bunch of simple rules, something very complex will happen. That's kind of and people call this emergence, this feed-forward process. You sort of turn the crank and something emerges. Well, we found out that sometimes that's what's happening in biology, but other times there's a very specific goal-directed process. When I say goal, I don't mean human-level purpose as in I know what my goal is. I don't mean that. I mean goal in the sense in which your thermostat has goals, or your self-driving car has goals, or a guided missile has goals. In other words, there's an error minimization loop where the system represents some kind of a state, and it has different degrees of ingenuity to get to that state, even if things go wrong or something, if things change or whatever. So we found that biology actually stores set points or morphological goals, and we can rewrite those goals. And that cells are basically a collective intelligence, not just your neural cells, like we all know that's a collective intelligence that helps make you, but all cells can make a collective intelligence that can reach certain kinds of goals. And you can rewrite those goals, which is amazing, because what we found is that those goals are encoded bioelectrically. Looking backwards, not such a shock, because this is how brains work. Turns out that's a much more ancient system. So we can do things like you take a flatworm, and the flatworm is regenerative. So you cut it into pieces, and every piece makes one head, one tail, very reliably, and you get your worm back. So it turns out that if you look, there's a bioelectrical memory in the tissues that tell you how many heads a worm is supposed to have. And we can rewrite that memory without touching the DNA. This is not about the hardware. This is not about the genetic hardware. This is about the memories that guide the problem-solving intelligence of the cells. And you say to those cells with a interface that we worked out, no, actually a good worm should have 2 heads. And then guess what they build? They build 2 heads. And now it's super cool. You can cut it into pieces, and those pieces will forever, as far as we can tell, it's been, 20 years that we've been doing this. Those pieces will continue to make 2-headed worms.
Oh, so if you have a 2-headed worm and you cut that one into 2, then the part will continue to make 2-headed worms.
Correct. That lineage, you have now made a lineage of 2-headed worms that will forever be 2-headed worm. And by the way, if you genetically sequence it, you will be none the wiser about it, because we haven't touched the genome. The genome is completely normal, right? So it's invisible to the standard methods of molecular genetics. So we can do that. We can alter these kinds of things in software, as it were. We've shown that certain kinds of birth defects, and this is in animal models, this is not in humans yet, but we're going hopefully to the clinic at some point. We can repair certain really nasty kinds of birth defects by reminding the cells, again through this bioelectric interface, reminding the cells what is the pattern that they're supposed to be building. So we can override certain kinds of birth defects. We can create new organs where they don't belong. So we've made tadpoles with eyes in their guts and things like this, where you can say to the cells, build an eye. And this is important. When we do this, we don't micromanage the genes. We don't micromanage the cells. We figured out a message that says, build an eye here. And the reason that works is because we're dealing with an agential material. It's a material that I don't have to be, as an engineer, I don't have to be in charge of everything. It has competencies. All I'm doing is plugging into those competencies. And if I can speak the language that it understands, and if I'm convincing, because that's a key part of this, you have to convince the material. This is not, there's ways that it will ignore you. If you do it wrong, it'll ignore you. So you have to be convincing, and then you say, build an eye here. That's what it'll do. It'll build an eye. We've done normalization of cancer. So injecting nasty human oncogenes into the frog model. Normally they make tumors, basically a dissociative identity disorder of this collective intelligence. And we could talk about what I mean by that, but you can reverse that by artificially forcing the cells into a particular bioelectrical state. And then you've normalized the tumor. The cells will go on to build healthy organs and do normal things, even though the oncoprotein is blazingly strongly expressed. And I guess the final thing I'll mention, we've done induction of regeneration, so allow animals that don't regenerate to grow their legs back. And we've made some synthetic life forms that are made of living cells, but in a form and function that has never existed on Earth before. These are some of the things that we work on.
Yeah, and so, I mean, this is, to me, it's amazing. I mean, it's amazing in the sense that this idea that, because we have to get to the right terminology, and so you use the word memory, okay? And what you mean by memory, and you relate the notion of memory to purpose, right? like there's a goal, and then that goal produces a memory, because we always think of memory as something in the past, but I keep telling people that actually a goal is a type of memory, because you're always aligning yourself towards that goal. You have to remember what you're doing, as you're moving towards the goal. Is that what you mean when you use the word memory?
Well, I agree with everything you just said. A goal, I do think, is a kind of memory that looks into the future. But there are other kinds of memory. There are many different kinds of memory, and there are other kinds of memory that don't involve goals, right? So there's habituation, sensitization. They're very simple kinds of memories that are not forward-looking like that.
Yeah.
But memory is a requirement, I think, for significant goal directedness. You have to remember what your goal is, otherwise it's not going to happen.
And so when you say that you give, let's say you give certain a being, you reprogram their memory, like what type of memory are you talking about here?
So there's two. Okay, in the experiment you're talking about. So there's a one-headed worm.
Yeah.
And we've created a technology that is kind of similar to what the neuroscientists do when they try to scan your brain and guess what you're thinking of. You know, this neural decoding kind of thing. So we have a technology whereby we can look at the cells of the planarian, and we can see visually, and we've made videos, like anybody can see these pictures and videos now, the bioelectric pattern that encodes for the collective intelligence the answer to the question, how many heads should I be building? Because all of this stuff, when you're injured, you have decisions to make. What are we going to build? Are we going to build anything? Should we grow? In what direction? There are many decisions to make. And there's a particular pattern that says how many heads we are going to build. And what's important is that it's a homeostatic process, because until that goal is satisfied, the cells are going to work really hard. They're going to keep working like your thermostat. It's going to keep working until the error is within acceptable, bounds. So we see that pattern that says one head, one tail, and we figured out a way to rewrite it. And so we go in and we rewrite it, and we say two heads. And my ultimate goal, the ultimate goal of the regenerative medicine side of the lab, is to be able to write any pattern you want. So complete freedom of embodiment. So first to rewrite all the normal human patterns. So you've lost a finger, or you've lost an eye, or you need a new liver, or whatever it is. Here is the pattern that will make the cells grow that for you from scratch every time. That's the goal. And then ultimately to be able to say new patterns, 5 fingers is good and all that, but what if I wanted something else, right? So ultimately you could have whatever. But that's the idea, to be able to communicate your goals to the collective intelligence of the cells in a way that they will then build whatever you want them to build.
Okay, so there you have some more snippets of his thinking, and he's been thinking about this for decades.
Right.
He's decided to try and put some meat on the bones, and I think it's exciting, and I think Ron was walking around this in a lot of his work. He was sensing there was something like this afoot. This is just,
Well, one of the interesting things about Ron's approach to reality is awareness. It
Right.
bypasses AI and bypasses concepts.
right.
You have awareness of what's actually really there. In other words, it's
But
self-correcting.
I'm sure he saw forms. I'm
Right?
sure he sensed I'm sure he saw patterns and forms in his own way.
Right. But the thing is, the way that's presented to the mind when there's awareness, it's much more complex.
Right.
What happens at more levels keep on arising. You get into it, and then you see there's a whole bunch of other things that are involved that you had no idea were there at all.
Right. Right. Yeah.
So
Yeah,
it's kind of
that's the problem with as you get better at doing this, you realize how little you know.
yeah, right. But it's also knowable.
Yeah. Yeah.
The thing is,
So,
so I
yeah.
mean, you can imagine that sometime in the future there's going to be more people who have memory, awareness abilities like Ron had,
Right.
and they can work together and would figure out some of these things that are, totally different from anything that anyone could possibly imagine. Because some of the things that he came up with were that way.
Yeah,
like
yeah.
the one where he told me about where he he was watching an electron
Right.
traveling through space, and every so often it would expand indefinitely and then come back and record that information.
Right.
I mean, who could ever think of something like that?
Right.
But that applies to everything. That applies to all
Yeah.
the cells in your body, for example.
And it's probably expanding far greater than the speed of light,
Yeah,
too.
it's
Yeah.
like, what's going on, really?
Yeah. No, no, it was a great observation. So, okay, we'll get back on track to Wednesday, a week from Wednesday. But
Okay.
thank you.
All right.
Have a great weekend. Okay.
All right, you too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.